Okay, gang, I guess we got our last couple has arrived, so we're good. This is week 10 of Col 126, the 8 cases that changed America. This is class number 19 out of 20. And what we've so far in the 9 weeks that we've spent together, we've had 18 basically 90-minute lectures on a couple dozen cases, focusing on 8 of the major cases that we've been dealing with. You've had 10 sections, most of you now, to get to talk about some of these things in detail. And we've reviewed the cases going all the way from the initial Black Panther case that I did to stop the Boston Police Department from seizing the Black Panther newspapers from the distributors and destroying them, all the way down to the Iran-Contra case that we've dealt with. Now, up to today, about 98% of the class here together has been sort of expository of my explaining certain details. We had about 1% of the time at the very beginning of me kind of laying out what I projected to be a major upcoming crisis that was going to be occurring here in the 21st century during your young adulthood as you got out into the world to ply whatever trade you're going to be engaged in. And then another 2% or so of the cases beginning explicating some of the principles behind cause lawyering and laying out certain different kinds of categories of cause lawyering that is now being written about. It was kind of strange for me because we never had any of that stuff until they started writing about us, I guess, that were doing that kind of thing. Just a small percentage of the time we've talked about some of the more general legal principles of constitutional law, like the First Amendment and the separation of powers and some of the respective roles that are played by the judiciary and the legislature, et cetera, but very little of it. It's not the amount that you would get even in most of your pre-law courses. But 80% or more of the time we've spent together has been devoted to dealing with the specific facts of specific cases. And another maybe 10% of the time discussing the general legal principles that were involved in that particular case, usually pointing up a very stark kind of confrontation that took place in the division among the justices with regard to how to resolve that particular issue in front of them. Lots of 5-4 opinions, very strongly held, extremely conservative positions on the part of people like Rehnquist and Berger and some of the newer justices, Justice Roberts and Alito and Thomas and others, and some actual quite liberal positions that have been taken during the Warren Court. And so about 90% of the time that we spent together has been dealing in those kind of specifics. And to date, we've spent probably less than 1% of the time really discussing the kind of philosophical underpinnings of these two contestants in these cases, the progressives on the one hand and the reactionaries on the other hand. And even less time than that, less than 1/2 of 1%, really ever articulating what my particular philosophy was about all of this, or why it is that I got into doing this particular kind of thing, this cause lawyering. So what I want to do today, in the next 4 hours that we have, the last 4 hours that we have together, I want to first just touch upon the two of the more recent cases of Bush v. Gore and Citizens United, because you hear so much about them. In any course that's going to be dealing with cases that have basically changed America in recent time, within your own lifetimes, couldn't leave these two out. But I just want to touch upon them by way of example as to exactly how far the reactionaries have come in succeeding in basically taking complete control of the judicial branch of the federal government, to the point of now 83% of all of the federal judges in the system have been appointed by either Ronald Reagan or George Bush Sr. or George W. Bush, or are left over, for some of them from Nixon and Ford, or have been all appointed by very conservative people governing the choice of judges. For example, in the Nixon administration, Rehnquist played a very major role as a special assistant attorney general in selecting very conservative judges, getting them as young as possible, usually from the Federalist Society, and they've engaged in this campaign of attempting to shut off the judicial branch of our government as an avenue toward progressive social change of any kind, and to really stop the judicial branch from being a vehicle for access to affirmative social justice of most any kind that we conceive of, even to the point of denying people the kind of traditional sense of justice that one would anticipate even in specific cases. And to eventually, in the case of Bush versus Gore, actually going to the lengths of making sure that the person who became president and was going to get to appoint the additional judges was the most conservative of all the candidates. So there have been a lot of articles written about these two cases, Bush v. Gore in Citizens United, but I just want to identify one article for each of those cases that you can take a look at, for depending on what you're doing your paper on, your final paper, and what other courses you're going to be taking, whether it's in graduate school or if you have more years left here. I just want to point out that there's an article that was written by Robert Perry about Bush versus Gore. It's called Bush v. Gore's Dark American Decade. And you can find it on the internet on Consortium News by Robert Perry. And he goes into a great length talking about Bush v. Gore, how it was so transparent that the 5 justices who were basically all appointed by Reagan and Bush actually had decided ahead of time that they were going to be having a certain outcome in that case, and that they were going to get George W. Bush made president. And he gets into some of the internal workings of the court at that time, pointing out that the court had originally, those 5 justices, had come up with the idea that because the state legislature in the state of Florida had allowed for a process of selecting the electors in the Electoral College, that because they'd set up a process that allowed there to be differences in the different voting districts. Some were allowed to use, for example, the optical scanners. Some were allowed to use the hand-cranked voting machines. Others were allowed to use paper ballots. That because they had so many different means of voting, they had different means of counting the ballots, and if there was a recount. And they had taken the position that the Florida State Supreme Court, in its ruling attempting to establish a common, fair, objective, and transparent process of recounting these votes, had actually undertaken to change the system that the state legislature had authorized, allowing great disparities in how they went about counting these votes. And so therefore they'd come up with the concept already of saying that, well, look, that effort on the part of the Florida State Supreme Court to establish a common, fair, equal process of recounting these votes overturned the legislature's statutory establishment of a system that had lots of differences. And therefore it violated the constitutional mandate that the state legislatures be the ones to set up how they chose their electors for president. And they had this decision actually all drafted up when the Florida State Supreme Court changed its ruling and offered a supplemental that authorized the different districts to use different methods. At which point they huddled up again and they came back and they said, well, that violates equal protection, because every single one of the people has the right to have their vote counted. And so therefore there has to be a similar vote recounting in each one of the districts. There has to be a similar treatment of them all. So they'd set up a catch-22 so that either way the court bobbed back and forth, they had an opinion prepared to defeat them. And Bob Perry goes into some detail about how that was all set up so as to allow Bush W. to come to the presidency so he could effectively choose the replacement for O'Connor, who was retiring, and actually chose the replacement for Rehnquist, that is Justice Roberts. And so that he points this out in this article, how transparent this was, pointing out that the Supreme Court had descended from high politics, of actually engaging in a constant program of attempting to establish certain principles, such as anti-federal government, states' rights, tax cuts for the very wealthiest, reduced regulation of businesses and financial institutions, tougher laws on law and order, and supporting a worldwide military and economic dominance on the part of our country. That was kind of the high politics, he pointed out, of the court. But they descended into low politics now of actually determining first who the president was going to be, and then later in the Citizens United, actually figuring out how to allow massive amounts of money to come flowing into the electoral system so that more and more conservative and pro-business people would be elected to the Senate and to the House. The consequences of which were, of course, the lessening of the number of Democrats in the Senate and taking over the House. He goes into some length in this article, Bush and Gore's Dark American Decade, which I would recommend to you if you want to get the understanding of what the analysis is of how that happened. The second article that I just want to point out before we get to our discussions is about Citizens United. And this is Jeffrey Toobin's article. It's kind of a pop article, but he had it in New Yorker magazine in May, just this month, May 21st of 2012. He had an article called Money Unlimited, how Supreme Court Justice John Roberts orchestrated the Citizens United decision. And this is a very helpful article to see the detailed steps that were taken by Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts and Scalia to choreograph getting to have this case come out in a particular way, when in fact the actual case that came up to them could have, and in fact had been briefed and argued to the Supreme Court to be decided on a much more narrow ground. In brief, what it was is that Citizens United is the organization that had been created by the same guy that did the old commercial for George Bush Sr. You may not have seen that one, the Willie Horton commercial. It's a pretty famous one that when Bush Sr. was running against Dukakis, there was this commercial that came on television with this close-up mugshot of this black dude looking kind of ominous and scary, and about how Dukakis had allowed him out on a parole, a weekend parole, and he'd murdered some people. And so they put this ad on television, and a lot of people attributed to this particular commercial a major loss of votes for Dukakis. And so this particular guy that had choreographed that had put together a new organization called Citizens United, and what he had done is he had figured out how to get around the new law that had been passed, the law that had been passed, prohibiting corporations from putting in major amounts of money to pay for political commercials within 30 days of an election. And so what this guy had done is he'd come up with the idea of having a documentary film dumping on Hillary Clinton, Hillary the movie. And it was a 90-minute documentary, And so he had the documentary all prepared, and he was going to offer it over cable television for people to be able to purchase access to this particular documentary. And so he said that by changing it into a documentary and making it purchasable, that in fact it didn't count as an advocacy piece. And so this had come all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Ted Olson, who had argued Bush v. Gore for Bush, was retained by Citizens United to actually make the argument in front of the justices. And Ted Olson had actually come in arguing that, look, we don't need to decide the constitutionality of prohibiting corporations from doing television advertising and all. All we have to do is have a narrow reading that this particular statute governing campaign financing doesn't cover documentaries, especially if they're for purchase on a cable station. So it's more like a book that you just buy it and you can read it. And so he made the argument in front of the court that you don't need to just decide on the constitutionality of the restrictions on corporations in general. You just need to decide as a matter of statutory construction that this particular type of documentary is not covered by the statute. And all those arguments were made, all the briefs were submitted, and what happened is that when Justice Roberts had sat down as the Chief Justice, he wrote the opinion for the court and started circulating it among the other justices, and then Justice Kennedy wrote a much more aggressive opinion in which he said, you know, I don't think we ought to be restricted to just they're asking us to say this isn't covered by the statute. I think it's completely unconstitutional to try to restrict corporations because they're just like people. And Justice Roberts thought that that was such a great idea that what he did is he withdrew his own opinion. And he said, okay, let's have Kennedy do this. And since he's going way beyond the boundaries of what was briefed to the court and what was argued to the court and what the other side was even given an opportunity to respond to, let's have this case re-argued. And so they did this extraordinary thing. On the final day of the term of the Supreme Court, they set up a re-argument on that case. And he didn't even wait until the first Monday in October, which would be the normal time that the court would start its next session. They scheduled the oral argument for the first week of September so they could get it decided in time to cover the election that was coming up next. And so, and Jeffrey Toobin goes into some length in his article called Money Unlimited, describing how clearly conscious this effort was on the part of Roberts. And then, as is pointed out in the articles, it says, to the dismay of all the liberal base of the Democratic Party, Barack Obama kind of surveyed the state of things after Bush v. Gore and after Citizens United, and he decided that he had to accommodate all of the reactionaries in the political party rather than take them on because of the massive amount of money that was going to be flowing in from the corporations to put more and more conservative people in positions of power. So he had to cater to those business interests, to the corporations, and that's why he set up his whole healthcare system in a way that basically was a gigantic multi-billion-dollar boon to the insurance industry. And why he, in fact, set up rules in response to the Wall Street, gouging of America. He set up a whole set of rules and regulations that didn't really change things much at all because he couldn't alienate those very kind of people. And so they go on to discuss what the impact, therefore, has been, and they refer now to the state that we're in as the post-Citizens United America, where billions of dollars are going to end up being spent during the next decade on the part of the major owners of corporations to basically purchase the elections. And that holds out very serious prospects for us in the future. So what I want to do today, before we start our general discussion about what your reflections are upon the course in general, I want to make a short presentation to you about what my take is on where we are now and what has led me into doing this kind of law, and a reflection upon what the prospects are for you if you were to decide to go into the area of law or journalism or anything else that deals with major public policy. I just want to do this as quickly as I can so we have time to talk about this in the final hour and in our final hour to our hour and a half on Thursday. So I just want to tell you that last Wednesday, just before our final class last Wednesday, Dr. Crosby invited all of us to come to her home for dinner. And we were discussing the class a little bit, and Sarah and I were there, and Danny Paul was there, and Randy, and Dr. Paul Lee, who participated in helping set up our doing the class here. And Dr. Crosby was reflecting. She was concerned. She expressed concern that the students in the class may be getting disillusioned. That we're becoming disillusioned about the legal process, really coming to see how kind of crass and craven it was and how completely biased the judges were in pursuing their ideological positions, etc. And she was concerned because she has a certain responsibility, an institutional responsibility, to try to assist in giving to students some kind of a useful matrix of understanding that will enable you to basically confront problems that you're going to have in your adult lives and help you solve some of these problems. Whereas if you're disillusioned about the efficacy of the legal system, that you wouldn't be prepared to deal with them. Now, in response to that, Randy Pozos suggested that he was concerned, equally and oppositely, appropriately enough, that you may be getting illusioned, actually, by this class. That given how bad things really were with regard to the reactionaries having seized control and what the prospects were for them seizing further control over the legislative branches, that I may be giving you the false sense that there was something you could really do about this. And Danny Paul, of course, has consistently offered the suggestion from sort of a postmodern perspective that attempting to give you any kind of belief system whatsoever is unrealistic and naive because from the postmodern perspective, nobody really knows anything for sure. And so therefore, the best thing for everyone to do is to become kind of moderates and pragmatists and kind of analyze things in each sense and figure out what you ought to do in this particular instance and not try to make any generalizations at all that might not be honestly applicable to the next situation. Now, I may not have been fair to any one of them in my understanding of what it is they were saying, but it did remind me of the story when we were talking about people being illusioned or disillusioned. It reminded me of what happened right after we got word that the Court of Appeals in the Iran-Contra case had sustained Judge James Lawrence King's dismissal, summary judgment of our case. Here, when we had the major principals that we'd charged with being involved in the bombing indicted by the Costa Rican federal government, and they were on the Interpol's 10 most wanted list around the world. And we had the indictments already down on the first 6 of the defendants whom we'd named by the special prosecutor. And yet, not only had the judge summarily dismissed our case, saying there wasn't even enough evidence to get to a jury, but the Court of Appeals, after Judge Vance had been killed with a letter bomb and replaced by an appointee of George Bush, had sustained their opinion. And so Sarah, I came back into the office the following Monday, and Sarah was sitting there with her head in her hands and she was saying, I am so disillusioned at their activity. And I said, great, that's really great, because it certainly doesn't do any good to continue to be illusioned. Okay, so the question arises is, what is this issue all about being illusioned or disillusioned? What it has to do with is how one goes about trying to understand reality itself. This question of how you, as students getting ready to go out into the world, whether you're going to go via law school or graduate school, or you're going to go right out right away, what kind of help are you getting in really trying to figure out how to construct a matrix of beliefs that have any kind of adequate solidity that can act as a basis upon which you can make moral judgments? Now, of course, I'm actually soliciting you to go into a profession of doing this for a living. I wouldn't say a living, but for doing it as your career. And you can figure out something else to do for a living. But the bottom line is that this group of reactionaries that we've been encountering in all of these cases all along, whether it's Richard Nixon in the Watergate case, or whether it's the Nixon administration in the Pentagon Papers case and waging war in Vietnam and lying about it and deceiving everybody, and or being involved in the Iran-Contra case in smuggling cocaine into the United States and buying weapons and carrying out assassination programs. These reactionaries, one thing you need to say about them is that they are true believers. That, I've never, in all the time I've encountered Oliver North and everybody else, and Oliver North and I got along fine. He knew who I was, I knew who he was. He was a true believer, and he knew that I was too. But the problem is that their reality on which they function is different from our reality. Now, how can that be? I mean, how can it possibly be that people who are intelligent, well-educated, well-intended, come up with completely different visions of reality? They were perceiving, for example, in Oliver North, they viewed the Sandinista government as a bunch of craven, totalitarian, communist, long-fanged vampires who were attempting to establish a beachhead in the middle of Western civilization for communism and totalitarianism. Whereas a lot of the people that we worked with viewed the Sandinista as sort of angelic beings that had come to the world to try to bring, food and education and health care and stuff for the poor and the oppressed. And even working with priests and nuns who were getting tortured and killed by the other side, just to prove that the other side was diabolical and satanic. So our reality is different from their reality. But the question that arises is our reality, whatever that might be, is that real? And how do you go about figuring out whether it's real enough to motivate you to become involved in advocacy? Because what is it you're advocating? Ad voca, what is it you're speaking on behalf of? What is the vision that you have that you're attempting to persuade others in general to accept, and in particular to apply to particular situations in a case like this? Or is this just the oldest song in the human family, ever since Cain and Abel, or the Hebrews and the Gentiles, or the aristocracy and the peasantry, or for that matter, for the Übermensch of Germany and the aboriginal peoples of the world? One would suspect from looking at history that perhaps the dialecticians are right, that the only real way that these types of contests are ever decided is in an ultimate confrontation between some particular thesis and some other antithesis, neither one of which is actually completely true, but in the thrashing together and clashing together and struggling, that somehow that you'll get closer to the truth. And there'll be some kind of a resolution, some kind of a synthesis that will, of course, become its own new operating thesis and will give rise to its own antithesis. This may be the only way to go about it. The problem is that is exactly the template that has been created by the rich and powerful so that they can always win. And what they're trying to do is to draw us into the contest of their template there's this side and that side, and if we go along and follow all of their rules and we end up losing, that we'll accept it, that we'll in fact accommodate ourselves to that. And that the problem is that they don't apply that template just to disputes. They apply that template to the resolution of every single public policy issue. It has to be a dialectic. It has to be a confrontation between A and B. Everything has to get reduced to that. And that the losers in that confrontation, even though they have bigger and more powerful knights in better armor, in better battering rams, and more money from the corporations, and can buy more television commercials, or on Proposition 29, they can massively bombard your house with, a dozen different shiny portfolios on why you ought to vote against Proposition 29 today. That kind of stuff. Because they think they'll always win because they're better equipped, they're more powerful, they have access to more wealth than we do. And what we're supposed to do is, because we accept the template by means of which the contest takes place, that when we lose, we will acquiesce to that. And we'll accommodate that. And we'll sit and watch absurd things take place right in front of us. And we'll say, well, they seem to have gotten there within the rules of us versus them. And so you look at the situation that we're in right now. According to the latest study of the Congressional Budget Office, that between 1979, just before Reagan and Bush came into office, all the way to 2007, in this 27-year period, with Reagan and Bush and W in there, that the annual income of the top 1%, the wealthiest 1% in the United States, grew by 275%. The bottom 90%, the annual income decreased by an average of $900 a year. The top 1%, however, their income increased by $700,000 a year. And between 1990 and 2007, the richest 400 people in the United States, their income increased by 395%. And that in their taxes during this same period of time were reduced by 37%. And that the top 1% average income by the end of that period of time was $960,000 a year. And so the wealthiest 1% owned and controlled over 35% of all of the resources and wealth in the country. And when you take the top 20%, the wealthiest 20%, they owned 85% of all of the wealth in the country. And the bottom 90% or 80% only owned 7% of the wealth in the country. And yet, the 80%, the vast majority of the 80%, are basically acquiescing to that. No matter how absurd it appears on the face of it. That how could that be allowed to have happened? Okay? And so that what we're looking at here is a very tiny percentage of people in the progressive community actually demonstrating, occupying, doing any kind of acting out in any kind of aggressive way, even effectively organizing to do anything to undo what's happening here. And now we've actually seen the National Defense Authorization Act get signed into law by Obama at 11:55 p.m. on New Year's Eve, signed into law expressly authorizing the president to designate American citizens as people who are providing material assistance to any organization that may have expressed bellicose activities toward the United States, which the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan just this last month, 5 different times, when he was challenged by Judge Forrest in front of the court in the Southern District of New York. 5 different times he was challenged, would material support be considered to include engaging in First Amendment activity of interviewing people from an organization that the president had designated as bellicose to the United States, just interviewing them and writing stories about them. 5 different times he refused to exclude those people from being subject to immediate arrest by the military, incarceration in a military stockade with no date for trial, no right to counsel, no right to habeas corpus, to have any charges presented against you at any time, and eventually to be able to be tried by a military tribunal, and if they chose to, sentenced to death without any appeal. And yet, look at the acquiescence in the face of that, of things having come to that. Now, it reminds me in the judgment at Nuremberg. It's way before your time, but there's a movie you ought to take a look at. It's called Judgment in Nuremberg, and Spencer Tracy is playing an American judge, federal judge, who's been assigned to the tribunal in Nuremberg, and there's a very prominent jurist, played by Burt Lancaster, who is a German jurist, who Spencer Tracy in the tribunal has found guilty of crimes against humanity, because he actually decided in a case to condemn to death a Jewish man that he knew was innocent. But in order to maintain his credibility and to be able to stay in a position of authority within the judicial system in Germany, he had felt he had to do that so he could stay in place to do more good in the long run. And at the very close of the movie, Burt Lancaster, as the German jurist, says to Spencer Tracy, he says, "Your respect for me is very important, and I want to assure you that when I entered this sentence against him, I never knew that it would come to this." And Spencer Tracy looked at him and he said, "When you voted to send one innocent man to death, and you knew you were doing it, it had already come to that." And that's what we're dealing with here with the National Defense Authorization Act. You know, for our people to stand and acquiesce to something like that is even worse than acquiescing to this massive transfer of wealth from the average people to the richest people in the country under a transparently manipulative Supreme Court and an administration that is engaged over and over and over again, the W administration, in overt criminal activity, writing memos authorizing torture, in kidnapping, in assassinations, in renditions. And now here we are on primary day, right, given the choice of whether we want to go and vote for the Republican or the Democrat. And go and vote for the Democrat who is going to allow the National Defense Authorization Act to be in place. And they voted against it. You know, Sam Farr voted against it, you know. But when he lost, he said, well, you know, it was us and them, and we lost, and they won, so they get the spoils of war. And so what I want to do is I want to, in closing my presentations to you and to begin our conversation, I want to just tell you the final story of the course, of the numerous stories that you've heard already. And this is one that I think will be helpful to you. And it came about when I had these major confrontations with Larry McKay. I told you, who was the senior partner at the Cahill Gordon law firm. He kept having me come up and talk to him about, Danny, why are you doing this? And you know, I tried to explain it to him, and I realized that I was having a hard time getting the language to explain to him why I thought that it was important, for example, to represent the Black Panthers in New York. You know, when after an 18-month trial, it took a jury, you know, 37 minutes to acquit them and find them innocent, actually, on all 157 charges. And not a single other person in the entire law firm would come to help on that. And even after it happened, they were embarrassed about the fact that I had been participating in getting that type of a resolution. And so when I'd gone to F. Lee Bailey's office, I remembered when I'd been asked to come out for the American Civil Liberties Union to be amicus counsel in the Wounded Knee trials out in South Dakota. And I came back from spending a week vacation out there working with them, and I came back to the office, and Lee Bailey called me, asked me to come into his office. He said, Danny, he said, I understand that you were out at Wounded Knee here for the past week. And I said, yes, I was. And he said, well, which side were you on? And I said, well, actually, I was helping to negotiate, trying to negotiate with the FBI and others to get foodstuffs and medical supplies and stuff brought in through the lines so people could have food and medical supplies and stuff like that. He said, look, why weren't you on the side of the FBI and the Justice Department? Because if, at least then, you could have earned some goodwill, and we could have then had you go and negotiate with the Justice Department on behalf of one of our clients. Like, for example, Michael Angiulo, the head of the mafia in Boston. And I was just so thunderstruck at the fact that we were just operating on completely different frequencies. That I was staying up at he was living out of town, so I was up at his place at Beacon Hill. And on Sunday morning, I was going to church down at St. Cecilia's, and I was on the way home, and I stopped into a bookstore, and I was rummaging around, and I found on the shelf a copy of A Theory of Justice by John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. So I picked up a copy of it, and I brought it home, and I started going through it, and I saw in here his discussion. He was writing a book on A Theory of Justice. He was attempting to identify the basic ethos that undergirds our theory of justice in Western civilization. He thought that it was going to be a very simple task, actually. He thought that he was going to discover that when confronted with a series of options as to how to address a particular public policy problem, that what was going to happen is our people were basically, and our system was basically going to select that particular option which generated the greatest good for the greatest number. Classic utilitarian type of decision. But he stated in the book that he was surprised that in fact it wasn't that, because there was this other thing going on in American culture. There was this group of people that he referred to as the intuitionists. The intuitionists who kept saying these strange things like all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, they go on and on about all of this stuff. And so I figured, I said, great, that must be it. I must be one of these intuitionists. But it's hard for me to sort of articulate and explain in clear linear language why it is that people like Larry McKay of the Cahill firm or Lee Bailey ought to do things like I think they should do instead of what they do. And so I said, good, well, I'll call him up. So I call up on Monday morning, and I asked to get some time to talk with Professor Rawls. And I waved the school tie at him. I'd graduated from Harvard College, and I'd studied with blah blah blah, and I was at Harvard Law School, and I did this case and that case, and can I get a few minutes with him? And he probably figured, here's an alumnus, and he must have lots of money by now, so I'll entertain him for about 5 or 10 minutes. So I go over to see him a little later in the week, and I sit down and I start having a conversation with him, telling him about the kind of cases I've had and done and the kind of confrontations I'd had with Larry McKay and Lee Bailey and all this stuff. And he gets more and more interested, so he cancels his next appointment, and we keep on talking, and he cancels his next appointment, we keep on talking. So I ended up being there with him for about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours. And he said I ought to come back to Harvard University after having graduated from the college and the law school and do a PhD thesis, comparing and contrasting these two particular modes of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism and intuitionism, and basically help him work on the next installment of his book, what it would amount to. And so I said, well, I'm not happy over at Lee Bailey's office, with all the stuff we discovered in the Watergate burglary case and all that, so I'll come back. So I went back to Harvard University. And that's when I discovered, a method that both of my teaching assistants have asked me not to talk about. And so I'll only talk about it briefly. And what I discovered I ended up, it was kind of peculiar, I ended up, my mother and father separated when I was like 12 years old, and I ended up living with an aunt and growing up and had to go on college on my own and all that stuff. And so when I ended up at Harvard College, I ended up, figuring, oh, brother, great, this is great. I can listen to these people, and they can give me good advice on how to deal with the world. and then I took one Gov 180, which had Henry Kissinger there. And Henry Kissinger starts his class out by saying, well, all of you people that are here, if any of you in this class believe that a nation state does not have the legitimate authority to kill and to lie and to take resources through military power to help their own citizens, they shouldn't be in this class at all. And so I said to myself, well, that didn't work, you know. And so, but what I did is I stayed there and took the course and confronted him and dealt with him to try to understand how it is that he was thinking, to try to understand that. But what happened is after I talked to John Rawls and I came back to Harvard at the graduate school level, after graduating from law school already, I ended up starting to do my master's thesis, working toward the PhD, on comparative ethics, comparative social ethics, which is right down on the button of what we're talking about here. How do you compare and contrast the modes of ethical reasoning of adherence to different social ethos, okay? And so without going into great detail and being challenged by any kind of a postmodern viewpoint that nothing is real, that let me say this, that what I was told by the chairperson of the Department of Comparative Social Ethics at Harvard University is that Talcott Parsons, the long-time 46-year chairman, actually, of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University, had undertaken a long and protracted inductive study of people around the world. And he had come to the determination that when confronted with a specific public policy choice, the members of our human family would actually divide into basically 5 different groups. And in order to try to maintain neutral principles, he just described them as the right systematists at the extreme right end of this socio-political spectrum he developed. And on the other end, there are left systematists. And that just inside each of them, working toward the center, there are left marginalists. And just inside the right systematists, there are right marginalists. And then in the middle, there are middle marginalists, as he called them. And so we were spending our time trying to figure out how to analyze different social policy questions and reading different people that had different positions on these things and trying to categorize them into these different places to figure out how in the world you help move people from being adherents to one particular position to another position so that you can build some kind of coalition of support for a change, right? And what we discovered is I kept going back to the professor, Ralph Potter, who was one of his proteges, and I kept saying to him, what are the criteria? What are the criteria for a person getting put into the left systematist position or right systematist position or one of the marginalist positions? What are those criteria? And he ended up finally, it took a long time kind of whacking on him to get him to kind of come through with this thing. But what he did is he designed a thing that they've referred to now as Potter's box. And Potter said that there are basically 4 major fundamental factual questions that every human being has to ultimately decide for herself or himself. And that depending upon the answer that one comes to with regard to these major questions, if you answer them in a way that is mutually consistent, one with another, that they're internally self-referentially consistent, the answers, you will actually end up with a specific mode of ethical reasoning. And it's the mode of ethical reasoning that characterizes these positions along the socio-political bar graph. Now, these 4 questions are things that people assume that they never really think about. But they are all the things that professional philosophers and professional thinkers spend their time thinking about and writing about and talking about. And the first one of these is your cosmology. That exactly how do you think the universe came into existence? And what particular laws or principles do you think it is therefore functioning consistent with? Secondly, second question is the teleological question. Do you believe that the universe is unfolding in some particular specific direction? Is there some sort of end product going on in the universe toward which it is evolving in some natural teleological manner? And if so, what is that? Thirdly is the ontological question. The big question is, how did consciousness, this thing that we experience, riding around up behind our eyeballs here and walking around, and this consciousness that we have of ourself as an individuated being in a material vehicle of some sort, how did consciousness actually come into existence in the warp and woof of all of these material particles that make up the universe? And fourthly, it's the epistemological question, and that is, what exactly are the means that we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can possibly answer questions like that? Are we limited to our five senses, even multiplied by particular technology, so that we can see farther into the universe and see farther into atoms and measure them? Are we limited to our five senses processed through our intellect in kind of arithmetic, logical reasoning to figure out what we can figure out? Or do we have some other means at our disposal by means of which to discern reality? Such as, do we have a fifth or sixth sense? Do we have a sixth sense, some kind of intuitive sense? Strangely enough, they were the intuitionists that are actually referred to by Rawls as the ones making all of these strange statements about the nature of fundamental rights and the integrity and dignity, the sources of dignity for people. And so the bottom line is, what they're asserting to us is that you're coming to some conclusion about the answers to those four questions. If you answer them in a self-referentially, internally consistent manner, will generate a specific mode of ethical reasoning, because you will choose to engage in conduct or make choices that are consistent with what you understand to be reality. Not a hard one, but if these profound determinants of reality itself you have certain clear positions about, then you will engage in activity that you believe and honestly believe to be consistent with reality. Okay? And that particular mode of ethical reasoning, if you answer all of the major important questions about life and policy and everything else pursuant to a consistent mode of ethical reasoning, it will generate a philosophy pursuant to which you can guide your life. And a philosophy, each one of the philosophies will in fact generate a political philosophy. It will answer questions about the public policy area of how a community goes about making decisions, how we might best make decisions together. There is a political conclusion that you come to, a political philosophy. And what I determined, and what I was writing my master's thesis on there, was that I determined that there were more than just five positions, that Talcott Parsons had left off his sociological bar graph, a right middle marginalist position and a left middle marginalist position, which were the classic liberal and conservative positions. And so that when you track the different political philosophies from right to left, you go from the extreme right systematists, which are in fact authoritarians, and one step into the to the left marginalists, you find the reactionaries. And one step further in toward the center, you find the conservatives. And then at the middle marginalists you find are your moderates. And one step to the right or to the left of the moderates are in fact the liberals. And one more step to the left, you find the progressives. And then out at the seventh position, the seventh paradigm or seventh worldview, you find the utopians, the kind of theistic, transcendental utopians. Okay? And so that what you have actually functioning is not a contest between progressives in the sixth paradigm worldview versus the second paradigm worldview reactionaries. What you really have is a debate going on among 7 different worldviews. And what Ralph Potter pointed out, and that they talked about at the school, was that, look, it doesn't do any good to argue about facts with people who have a different worldview. Because if you're not talking about their cosmology, or you're not talking about their teleological assumptions, or you're not talking about their ontological assumptions, or their epistemological assumptions, you are wasting your time. And all of these discussions that go on at lower levels are all bullshit. That all of these discussions are just means by which they rationalize getting to where they want to get to, predicated upon their assumptions that put them in one or another of these places. Okay? So the question arises then is, what are we going to do about this, or what should we do about this? And what I'm arguing is that the United States Constitution was drafted by people who adhered to a particular worldview. And that is a sixth paradigm, natural law, radical monist worldview. They had certain assumptions about the answers to these fundamental questions. And they constructed a constitution with a Bill of Rights that was rooted in this particular worldview. And for example, one of the people that you've almost certainly never heard of, and you could go through not only your entire college career, but indeed your law school career and never be told about it at all, is a fellow by the name of John Witherspoon. And Professor John Witherspoon was an adherent to the Scottish Enlightenment natural law worldview. And he was the professor of moral philosophy at Princeton University, at that time called the College of New Jersey. And he was the professor of moral philosophy from 1768, prior to the Revolution, all the way to 1794. For 26 years, he was the professor of moral philosophy at Princeton University. He was a signator to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was a member of the First Continental Congress from 1776 to 1782. He was the principal drafter of the Articles of Confederation, under which the United States government existed from 1781 to 1790 or 1789. He was an active advocate of the new Constitution in 1789. He was a member of the New Jersey Colonial Legislature that ratified the Constitution of the United States. And as a professor at Princeton University, he was the professor for James Madison, who was the principal drafter of the American Constitution. And he also was the professor for Aaron Burr, who is the man who killed Alexander Hamilton, who was the major proponent of the opposing view to natural law. And Professor Witherspoon was the moral philosophy professor for 3 United States Supreme Court justices, 37 federal judges, 12 members of the Continental Congress, 10 U.S. cabinet secretaries, 21 United States senators, and 39 congressmen. And he was the professor for 52 of the 188 members of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of America in the United States. For a little background on that, I'll just give you a couple of references. Take a look at a book that's called Whose Justice? What Rationality? Written by Alasdair, A-L-A-S-D-A-I-R, Alasdair McIntyre, M-C-I-N-T-Y-R-E. And there's another book by Jeffrey Morrison called John Witherspoon and the Founding of the American Republic. Okay? Now those are things that you aren't really going to be told about, because the basic worldview of natural law that undergirds our entire Constitution has been deemed to be passé by the world of postmodern philosophers. They say, no, wait a second. You've got to stop and take a look at this. They said that the theory of the natural law Enlightenment people, the Scottish Enlightenment, was that somehow there is an infinite sea of undifferentiated consciousness that pre-existed the universe and that enfolded the material universe into reality and then basically doesn't intervene in any way. It's a classic deist theory. And that there's a whole set of principles, physical principles, that are operative within the physical contours of the universe that function completely naturally. And that if we as human beings are able to discern what those principles are that are functioning, and we can consciously, through an exercise of our own free will, we can in fact accommodate our own conduct, both individually and collectively, in the way that is most harmonious with the natural order of being. Now you remember that one? That's the one that Crane Brinton, the 52-year chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, designated as the single most important idea that he had ever encountered in his entire exploration of human history. Okay? And so what I'm saying is that I think that we are perfectly authorized to utilize, to explore and to understand the fundamental worldview of natural law principles as they obtained at the time of the founding of the United States Constitution, and attempt to try to understand them in the most modern terms possible. Most importantly, based upon the insights that we have into quantum physics now. That this capacity to integrate the insights from quantum physics in the ability of human intention to actually have direct impact upon the manifestation of material reality in front of us are areas that you should explore if you are thinking of going into the world of public policy. Because my position is that if you thoroughly understand the natural law worldview and you give full credit to the postmodern critique that is going to be leveled at you, but understand the postmodern critique is going to be leveled at any one of these worldviews. And so that if you try to adopt any one of these worldviews and to use the principles of that worldview as a consistent mode of ethical reasoning to guide your judgment and your advocacy out in the world, you will be attacked by the postmodern philosophers as being naive, that somehow your theory as to how the universe came into existence cannot be proven. You can't prove it. You can't weigh it, you can't measure it, you can't taste it, and until we do, you have to be a pragmatist. You have to be a middle marginalist. You have to be a person who is going to analyze every given situation that you're confronted with and kind of figure out basically what you think ought to be done, not resorting to any set of consistent principles. Okay? And so I'm suggesting that that is not a way to be a leader. And that if you're going to be advocates, whether you're journalists, whether you're authors in general, or whether you're lawyers, whether you're politicians or public servants, whatever it is that you're going to be doing to try to serve the public interest, you have got to, if you're going to be leaders, and advocates are people who invite other people to follow them, you've got to have a consistent mode of ethical reasoning. And I'm suggesting that if you're in the field of dealing with the Constitution and the laws of our country, that you should look into the Scottish Enlightenment and the natural law worldview that was believed in by James Madison, who was the major drafter of the Constitution, by John Witherspoon, who was his professor, and by this long list of people that were very much involved at the founding of our country. Of these, one president, and Aaron Burr, and 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices, 37 federal judges, etc. That these people were instrumental in the founding of our country. And that not by taking a snapshot like some of the pseudo-federalists would do, of saying, well, did the founders believe in women voting? That's not the point. The point is, when you look at what they say they believed in, wouldn't it be perfectly clear that in order for them to be consistent and responsible, they would have to acknowledge the right of women to vote, and that they wouldn't be able to support the institution of slavery? Okay? What they did is they were accommodating those things, such as slavery, out of trying to be pragmatists. Don't try to be a pragmatist if you're not a pragmatist. That's my position. No one's ever gotten the impression I was a pragmatist. And so that's my position in my opening remarks. And what I want to do is I want to talk with you. I warned you at the end of last class is that I wanted to talk with you instead of at you about some of these things, to find out just how much progress does having taught this course, and you're having taken this course, how much progress, if any, is that going to generate in attempting to make our world a better place? Because I don't want you to have to think it's just one more course you took because you had to get all your credits. I came here to be with you, to talk with you about these cases, to raise these issues such as I've just raised with you, for a specific purpose. And that is to try to prepare you for what is getting ready to happen to you. And the fact is that as you sit there still, you don't really believe it. I've been through this 1,000 times, I can assure you, of trying to tell people something and they didn't believe it when I tried to tell them. And what I'm telling you is that the way that the thing is going right now, with this Supreme Court in place, and with Obama, no matter what anybody tries to tell you, getting ready to win again, which he's going to do, and continue his policy of placating these reactionaries and these major corporations, and be basically soliciting all of their financial support, to not only get him in for his second term, but to position the Democratic Party so that they can continue to share in the spoils and control the government. The fact of the matter is, they're not going to solve anything. They're not going to solve anything. The Supreme Court's going to strike down the health care bill. Just write it down. They're going to strike down, and they already know, the 5 of them already know that they're going to do that. And Justice Roberts is going to figure out how many different arguments they have to come up with in order to justify it. Okay? And Obama's going to go, well, I tried. I actually made great concessions to the insurance industry, $400 billion for them, and the Republicans still wouldn't accept it. So don't blame me. You don't become president to be able to say, don't blame me. And they aren't going to do anything to seriously address the global warming and the massive climate change that is coming. And it's going to, you can see on the news, you watch in any given week, you're going to see one story. They just have the whole town. They're having to move an entire town out of Louisiana because the water's rising and swamping their entire town. And it's going to go on all across the planet. Tens of millions of acres of land is going to be inundated by the rising sea levels. including land that has nuclear power plants, such as San Onofre, in Diablo Canyon. And one of these nuclear power plants is going to melt down sooner than later, And so that what I'm saying is that we're getting ready to face a major period of destabilization with a massive climate change that's on its way, the dislocation of literally almost 53% of the human population that lives within 20 miles of the seacoasts. And they're going to be moving inland and taking over land that people already own and aren't going to stand for. Major water wars over the remaining water, because with the melting of the global ice caps and the salinization of the aquifers along the seacoast, we're going to be losing 2/3 of all of the potable water on our planet. And you still don't believe it. And so what I'm saying is that you're going to have to prepare yourself for trying to do something about this. And not just get yourself into a position of, in 35 years saying, gee, I wish I'd known this, when I was 20 years old. Because you do know it when you're 21 years old. Okay? And so that what I'm saying is that I want to have a discussion with you now for the rest of the time, next class and the remainder of this class. I want to be able to talk with you about, what it is that you're planning to do professionally or graduate school, etc. And I want to know, how that is directed toward participating in this particular process that we've talked about. Some of you could say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to become a banker, or I'm going to go to Wall Street, and I won't flunk you for that. I'll have one of the TAs do that. But I just need to know what it is that you're planning to do about any of this. And has anything that I've told you about how we were able, in the face of this same consistent opposition from these same reactionaries, people with the same kind of power and money, that we were able to accomplish portions of success all along the way here, okay? That I just want to know whether or not it's had an adequate influence on you to motivate you to do anything about this upcoming crisis. Because you're not only going to have the global warming and the global climate change, you're going to have massive disruption, dislocation of the economy, major collapse of the economy. No economy is going to be able to survive, in its present form, the kind of things that are going to happen. And the rise of the national security state, which are going to rise to try to quell disturbances, get everybody under control, figure out how to move people the way they need to, and to distribute the water. All of that is going to require a major national security state. And that, so what I'm asking you now is what you plan to do about it. Because the state's going to be there having you climb on board. Come on, be part of the problem, and but get the rewards for being part of the problem, and let the other people suffer the consequences.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's, as you were describing the worldviews, and to be a leader, you have to, in your opinion, you have to emphasize one worldview, and you can't necessarily be a pragmatist because that doesn't work. I was wondering, how do you create a coalition then for change? Because you wouldn't have enough support by just being yourself and having people flock to you. You would need to create others to come with you.
Yep.
So would you, in that circumstance, you can be pragmatic, or is it that you lead by example and then have others follow you in that way? Or
Yeah. What it is that a substantial majority of the adherents to any one of these 7 worldviews couldn't pass a test on it. You know, I mean, they adhere to it because their grandparents were that, or their parents were that, or they happened to grow up and all their peers are like that. You know, so that the vast majority of people in the country, that you can reach them, but you're going to have to reach them dealing with these major 4 questions. That's the point. So strangely enough, there are professions to be sought as cosmologists here, as professional philosophers here, you know, as all kinds of different things that can address these questions. Because if, in fact, for example, we can definitively prove, to the satisfaction at least of a vast majority of people who are subject to change, if we can prove that the cosmological assumptions of authoritarians that the right system of disposition is not true, that the physical universe is in fact expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and that every single element in the entire universe is disintegrating at the rate of its own specific atomic breakdown, disintegrating into all of its lower constituent parts, and they're eventually, every single element in the universe, every atom of an element in the universe is going to disintegrate into its constituent inchoate quantum fields. And they're going to continue to not only move out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, but are going to be moving out and away from every other one into an ultimate state of no thingness. You know, if we can disprove that, then we're going to go a significant way, 25% of the way, in disarming the authoritarians. Because the authoritarians, their whole mode of ethical reasoning is rooted in that particular cosmological assumption, that basically everything is going to hell in a handbasket anyhow, and that there's no real coherent order to things. All of that is an illusion on your part. All of you are trying to make up meaning or value in life, whereas all that really counts is the short-term gratification for you and yours. You know, I want to get more. I want to have more. I want to be on the boat that goes inland, you know, when all this starts to happen. I want to be the one that's got the cache of fresh water there, because I have agreed to do things that have made it only more inevitable this is going to happen, and I've been rewarded with, you know, 7 million gallons of water, you know, in the terms of shekels. They'll give it to you. You know, and so but this, what I'm saying is that if you direct some attention, scientific investigation, thinking, research, exploration, writing, you know, basically attempting to show that that cosmological set of assumptions is not true, you'll go a great deal of the way in disarming the authoritarians at that end of the spectrum, okay? Now, on the other hand, if you can prove that, in fact, the universe, in fact, is contained in an infinite and eternal sea of absolutely undifferentiated consciousness, and that every single inchoate quantum field in the entire universe is in fact a condensed unit of consciousness, and that we as individual human beings can access that unit of consciousness, and from that perspective can actually make determinations not only of the kind of linear material rules and principles that are functioning in the universe, but can actually have insight into potentially the motive force that enfolded the universe into material being to begin with, then you've gone a long way into starting to recruit people to come to follow you in this particular worldview. For example, Wayne Dyer, you know, get a load of Wayne Dyer if you haven't seen him. You know, Wayne Dyer is the real deal. You know, he's just walking around telling everybody about the sixth paradigm. You know, and he has been designated as the third most influential spiritual person on the planet today. Okay? And he's not asking anybody to, you know, riot and pull up the cobblestones and pull down the rich and behead them. He's saying, you know, look, you just got to all be confident in what you can do.
So, assuming that all the paradigms are correct. What I don't agree with is that that they're necessarily that fixed. I feel like there's a lot of people in the middle, like from experience, that aren't drawing it on a chalkboard. You didn't draw it, but I was imagining that you would draw it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that are not thinking in that terms, and when you like press them on this, they'll give you a sort of assumption that they have, but a lot of times I feel like they don't really have like a fleshed out idea. So those are people that you could easily get to one or another side, but I also feel like those are often the people who you describe as reactionaries because they don't have an idea and they're sort of just reacting.
Yeah.
And so if you can get, something for them to believe in, like Sarah Nelson was even saying, right? Like how you change your ideas, right? When you were young.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's absolutely right.
People are not born like that, right?
No, there's an interesting work. The fellow wrote a book recently called The Righteous Mind. And he actually postulates a theory that, in fact, one's initial membership in one or another of these particular worldviews is genetic. Is because that over time, down through the millions of years of evolution of the human family, different tribes have in fact come to different kind of collective experiences. And some of them have discovered that by yielding to the community and sharing responsibility and benefits, that they've been more successful in surviving. And others in different places have found that vanquishing and aggression and domination and all that kind of stuff and the acquisition of other people's resources has worked out for them. And so it's genetic and it's completely unconscious. And so he's suggesting that it may be a more difficult task than we might think.
Right. Well, what I mean to say is, though, if like all of a sudden it becomes evident that we're faced with some sort of flood or something, I feel like people will easily change and even start to regret, and like maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing.
No, you're right. No, you're right. The principle is completely correct. The fact of the matter is that a substantial percentage of the people who believe in any one of these particular worldviews or are adherents to these worldviews haven't thought about it thoroughly. And assuming that the fellow who wrote Righteous Mind is not correct, and that there are more philosophical and sociological and environmental reasons why people initially adhere to one or another of these worldviews, they will be subject to persuasion.
Like you talked about how there were still Nazis and fascists, right? And
Yep.
they kept going. But what about all of the other people that were swept along with that, right? They regretted it, obviously, a lot of them did.
That's right, and that's why now you can see, for example, in Germany, that you can get some fairly progressive, legislation passed and other things. That's right. And so what I'm saying is I'm trying to recommend to you, without illusioning you, that the fact is that there's reason to be optimistic about being able to be successful at this particular endeavor. But you have to know what the endeavor is. Don't go arguing with a Bush covert operations chief in the CIA, like Cofer Black. Don't go arguing with him about the facts relating to the Sandinista, because you're wasting both your time and his. What you need to do is you need to look for people that are more open to this thing, who haven't thought about it really thoroughly, who haven't committed themselves to it yet, and talk to them in a way that's open and honest, compassionate, considerate. It is a ministry that I'm talking about here. This is a social ministry that you're trying to minister to the people. You're trying to explain to them, what it is but you need to come to understand it in greater depth than you probably do right now. You need to really study these things and find out about these things. Watch people like Wayne Dwyer and others who are good advocates and stuff. Guys like Deepak Chopra. They're very graceful. They're very charming. They're very, they're not manipulative. There's lots of people that you can see who are trying to do this thing, and it is by means of this particular kind of advocacy directed to deep issues, that stand the chance of helping to get people prepared so that we can move people from some of these more reactionary, authoritarian, and conservative beliefs. But at the same time, you have to understand that it's an existential process to some extent, because it's going to be some time before we're going to be able to definitively prove that the cosmological assumptions and ontological assumptions and teleological assumptions, etc., of the natural law worldview are absolutely true. But what you've got to understand is that they generate a lot better product. They generate a compassion, they generate sharing, they generate success on the part of a lot more people. They don't, in fact, generate 1% of the people owning 35% of all of the goods while other people are starving to death.
It sounds like quite a pragmatic argument.
No, I'm just saying that you need to know that that's true as well, and I believe that if in fact you follow, for example, certain of the practices, that most of the adherents to the natural law worldview, in this sense of it, believe in that there are certain types of activities of meditation, a certain kind of diet, certain kinds of abstention from certain kinds of self-abusive type of conduct. If you follow a certain type of pattern in your life, that your intuition will improve dramatically, and that you will gain deeper and deeper intuitive insights into the bona fides of these assumptions about the cosmological sources of our being, etc. And that's been said to be over and over again. You can read people like Sri Aurobindo, you can read people like Gandhi, you can find about all kinds of these people who have talked about things that you need to know about. And I'm just suggesting that if you want to be advocates, journalistic advocates, authors, lawyers, people in public policy, public intellectuals, etc., that it is going to be well worth your time to examine the underlying assumptions about the constitutional structure that we have here.
What answers to these epistemological, ontological, and other four questions have led you to generate the political philosophy and reality that you have?
It's basically I'm
This will be the last question.
okay. I'm a fairly simple guy. That when I ended up at Harvard College and Harvard Law School and stuff, and looking at the various options that were available, I realized when I got out practicing law, I was at the #1 law firm in the entire world, basically, and I was with F. Lee Bailey, the #1 criminal defense attorney, and I was looking at these people and I'd say, this is terrible. What these people are doing is terrible. I'm trying to do things that are helping people, et cetera. The things that I picked up from basically, going to church most of the time, and studying constitutional law, studying progressive history, et cetera. Those things tended to appeal to me a lot more. They resonated a lot more. So what I did is I began to explore these very questions. And what I discovered is the answer to these questions that the progressive worldview of natural law, progressive worldview, believe in, intuitively seem to be the truth for me. That's that's how it got. So I spent more time meditating, spent more time fasting, spent more time, talking to other people of various gurus and teachers and ministers and priests and rabbis and stuff. People who are into this kind of thing. They actually form big coalitions of social ministry people around the country. And so that, for a person like Martin Luther King, for example, to be, just leading people down a public highway to try to be allowed to go to the public schools, and if other people come out and beat them on the head and attack them with dogs and stuff like this, I say, let's see, which side do I think I want to look into a little more here? And you look into their positions and their worldviews and stuff, and you discover that those are a lot more sympathetic than the other ones, And so that's how I have found this. I don't pretend that a lot of it doesn't have to do with my having gone to church like every Sunday almost for my whole life, because I was listening to these people. I was sitting there, I wasn't giving them any money, when they send the baskets around and stuff, and I was just sitting there listening to them, and I kept saying, look at, it's really strange that one day out of every week, people all come together and they talk about being really good people, about being really nice and sharing and helping other people and being compassionate toward other people and stuff like that. And I said, this is an interesting social group.
Especially compared to the other 6 days.
That's right. And so that what I would do is I was inquiring into it. I was looking into it more. And when I ended up going to study comparative social ethics at Harvard University at the recommendation of John Rawls, I was completely shocked to discover that I was at the Divinity School. That I thought that I was going to be in the regular PhD program inside the Department of Philosophy doing a comparative thesis on utilitarianism and intuitionism. But it turns out that the chair of comparative ethics at Harvard University was at the Divinity School. And so when I started looking into this stuff about, as an investigator, a professional trained lawyer investigator, I started looking into what the assumptions were of all of these people. I said, look, this is a lot more profound than I had thought it was. You know, that you can dig deeper into this and discard all of the kind of childish stuff that you've been told, you know, from the time that you're 5 years old. You know, that there aren't, angels with wings flapping, sitting on clouds with harps and stuff, any more than there is a Santa Claus. But there is such a thing. There is such a thing as a long tradition in the human family. On December 21st at the winter solstice, of people giving gifts to each other and sort of beginning the new year. And that whole thing has existed in the human family. We've known about it for a long time. There are certain ways of kind of institutionalizing it, enculturating it, et cetera. And if you can pull away from the particulars and try to understand the general insight that our human family has into this, you can then revisit it and reshape it. And that's what you really need to do. That your job in your generation, in your century, in which you are the civic generation of your century, of this 21st century, and are going to be the ones tasked primarily with responsibility for addressing and successfully solving this major secular crisis that you're going to be confronted with, that you need to dig down and revisit the fundamental values on the basis of which our civilization and our culture has been established, and reform those and put those back together again in a way that is going to be able to reconstruct a viable culture in the face of this serious crisis that you're going to be encountering.
Thank you.
So. Yeah.